Hope everybody had a good lunch. I look around the room and there are new faces, which is fabulous. Otherwise, we really would have a dead-end formula for a new emerging industry. And then there are other people that I see in the room, and Richard referenced it earlier about our first trip to the SEC. And then one of my favorite people in the world, Candace Klein, is here in DC, which is wonderful. Joy Schaffler, who gave her views, and Joy, who struggled with whether or not she was or wasn't a founding member of CIFRA, CFPA. She's honorary at the very least. And Steve Sinelli as well, as I look at Steve. Obviously, Steve's been doing this a long time. Brian from Canada. What I want to say, this is all in the context of this is not 3 years ago. We're not having the same conversation, which was a bit like just spinning our wheels about all the concerns in the industry that the regulators were going to have with any of the provisions, truthfully, and the concerns about fraud and the concerns about curation versus whether or not a funding platform can curate, cannot curate. It's 3 years later, and I'm here to debunk a lot of the mythology if you're not aware of it. Title II is alive and well, and it's doing exactly what it was supposed to do. It may, as Sarah points out, not be as large a current opportunity as maybe some people portrayed it to be. That doesn't disqualify or invalidate it in any way whatsoever. Legitimate people, small business people, who previously might not have been able to raise capital have done so. That was what the Jobs Act was all about. Title III will allow a different group of people to do it, and Title IV similarly has its own relevance to certain members of the community who will find their own way to use it one way or another. Welcome back, Joy. So the things, and we're debating whether or not Title III still has a right to proceed, which is an absurdity. It was a bipartisan congressional piece of legislation signed into law by President of the United States. It has to happen. It's mandated. So the discussion about its merits again, I'm sorry, that ship has sailed, and it must proceed because it is what Congress said ought to happen. And actually, it offends me that that conversation still takes place. You can debate what rules should be part of the final rules, and I think that that's a worthy conversation to make sure it's as viable program as it can be. But I've listened to 3 years worth of nonsense about whether or not it's going to be problematic. People will lose money. I've lost money. Other people will lose money. People lose money every single day in different programs. Registered securities, just because things are reviewed by the SEC doesn't mean that those securities are not risky. That's nonsense. So Title III needs to proceed, and the good news is that Title II has already proceeded and is doing good things. The fact that we have representatives from other parts of the world that are taking interest and already have crowdfunding, various iterations of our Title II and III, demonstrates that there is an absolute worldwide interest in entrepreneurship and raising capital. And not everybody went to Harvard or Stanford Business School and knows the right lawyers and investment bankers. And the reason I'm passionate about it, even though I actually come from a successful legal family and take the responsibilities of lawyering seriously, there's an equal responsibility with the retailization of securities programs to enable people who don't have access to capital to have access to that capital. And Title III is a way of putting our substance behind what our rhetoric, which is we always say, oh, in a democratic society, everybody should have the right to vote. Well, in a capitalist society, everybody should have the right to invest a certain amount of their money the way they want. It doesn't have to be forced through the established channels so people can get their tithing of commissions through registered securities. I just don't believe that. People have the right, like friends and family, to invest in private securities, and they should be able to do it online. And I'm winging this, by the way, because Sydney didn't tell me what to talk about today. But what, and so that great populism, I believe, and hopefully someday I'll actually get to witness it. Title II in a year and a half has done good things, as I mentioned. And the other thing, and you have to really look at the underlying data point, which is what Richard is so specialized in. So there's some things that are happening in Title II crowdfunding, which I'm encouraged by. I don't have as many good data points as I want, and Richard mentioned it earlier. Crowdfunding is an alternative means of finance. If you can raise venture capital from the traditional Sand Valley venture firms, good for you. Go public through Goldman or whatever, that's great. But women have not historically been able to do it, and there is some early evidence that crowdfunding will change that paradigm. That's Title II, and it's absolutely true in non-securities-based crowdfunding, Kickstarter for sure. And that's because it's money being raised from your community of people that you know, through your contacts that you heretofore were not able to access money from. In Kickstarter, obviously, it's not the sale of securities. It could be a pre-order campaign, but it's people who believe in you as an individual and want to support you. And that's fabulous. And a derivative of our crowdfunding initiative as a law firm is we actually are very involved in the women's entrepreneurship movement as well, because we think it has a perfect nexus with crowdfunding. So that's a great thing that's come about or may come about through crowdfunding. And the other thing that's a mythology from 3 years ago, the two big mythologies besides fraud, and it's not to be respectful of the concern of fraud, but as Richard pointed out, statistically speaking, in the overall capital markets and in friends and family, and if you speak to state regulators, while it does happen, it doesn't happen nearly to the degree of, I forget what your term of art was, but it wasn't hysteria. It was a more artful term than that. We take anti-fraud seriously. The next one was, though, that it's adverse selection, as well as if the crowd is in the deal, institutions won't participate. That has not turned out to be true. There are plenty of sites online today where the crowd, the accredited crowd, participates alongside not only venture firms, but corporate strategic investors. And you can go on, Circle Up has Procter & Gamble as a partner, Our Crowd has GE Capital as a partner, and these things take time, but 3 years or 18 months into Title II, we're seeing evidences of the marketplace maturing and developing in a way that gives credibility to what we've done. The next thing is that Silicon Valley and the venture firms don't believe in crowdfunding. Well, that's not much of a shock, actually, because all established market participants want to believe that the way they do things is the only way of doing things. When we started our SPAC program years ago, which is an alternative means of finance, everybody wanted to say that the SPAC program was disreputable and only low-end providers who couldn't get money from endowments were the ones who would actually touch it. And it took a long time, and it's taken a long time, but it is a very good program now. And the highest of high-end private equity sponsors participate in that program, with the largest underwriters in the world participating as underwriters. And Brian asked me a little while ago, was I aware of the 2 Canadian SPACs that just happened in 2015, and we're U.S. counsel to both of those? So yes, but that took a long time to happen. These things do not happen overnight, but with enlightened rules and quality professionals, as well as commercial people who are dedicated to making it a good program, as Joy mentioned earlier, it will happen in an intelligent way. It's not going to happen overnight, and the reason I can tell you it's happening is here are the objective data points. In 2015, multiple crowdfunding platforms raised money from venture investors. Richard, you want to give some names, dates, monies? But at least 4 or 5 platforms have raised nearly $10 million each. And if Candace wants to share her story with you in a little while, she can. These platforms are doing good things. They're getting money from responsible, established capital markets participants. They are going to chaperone these people to make sure that this industry is doing the right thing, as well as other commercial participants and lawyers. And I am extremely encouraged by where we are overall, even though we don't have Title III. So whatever you can do to help me get Title III moving along, that would be much appreciated. Thank you very much. I'll take the easy questions. I'll give Mark the difficult ones.
Where's the petition?
Thanks, Kim. Any questions? I guess the early panels did a good job. Well, a gentleman in the back.
Yeah, so Bill Cunningham, Doug, you and I spoke about 2 years ago. I gotta say, I'm pleased, but I'm a little shocked by your change in attitude about crowdfunding in general. You recall that you and I had a conversation about 2 years ago where the talk back then was all of this fraud stuff. Oh, it's gonna be fraud. And I was specifically focused, I launched blackcrowdfunding.net back then, ran it for a year, specifically focused on the impact that it would have on minority and women companies. And it seems to me that the whole crowd has come to my way of thinking, which is good. But I'm wondering kind of where that change is coming from. What's changed in your attitude about Title III and Title IV crowdfunding from 2 years ago? And I forget that, you remember that conference, right? It was at that hotel right around the corner from Union Station. That Sarah was there, was a couple of other things.
The George. It's funny, I remember the hotel, not the conversation, actually. I guess you must have meant Doug Elliman, not Doug Ellenoff. I find it hard to believe that was a conversation that I participated in, because I don't think that was ever my point of view. Title II, I've always been much more concerned about suitability, because I love Title III. I think it's enlightened. I think the structure of it is comprehensive. It's got limitations, investor protection. It's regulated. It's done online. It's transparent. So with all due respect for your passion, clearly, I don't think I was worried about fraud in that regard. I have always been concerned that Title II, even though it's accredited investors, needs a suitability overlay, because I'm concerned about people putting too much money into liquid securities overall, not having diversification, and losing it and changing their ability to maintain their quality of living and their standard of living, and becoming a ward of the state. So I don't know if I was having a bad hair day, or if we misunderstood each other, or maybe I was at the George and you weren't. But in any case, I don't think my view on that's changed at all. And the good news, regardless, is there hasn't been any, and that's Richard's point from earlier. And for people who keep drumming that tune, it's not turned out to be true. And I can point to plenty more cases in the public securities market. Nothing against that, because I do a lot of that business as well. Where there's fraud, and then the conversation we always come back to is fraud versus failure. Losing money is not necessarily fraud. Saying you're going to spend money pursuant to a use of proceeds that you don't adhere to, and pocketing that money, is fraud. So I think there has to be a liberalization of the standard of what is fraud in smaller issuances, because just because somebody says something that may not be technically written the way I would write it in my registration statements doesn't make it fraud per se. But it's not to encourage people to use hypey sort of language, but you have to be careful as to what you're calling that, in fairness. Anybody else recall any other things that I want to take back? Joy, Doug, you're not just a fraud in crowdfunding, you're a fraud in SPACs and RDs and pipes. Thank you very much.